right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Corky, and I'm with Yolo Basin Foundation, and welcome to Flyway Nights. We have a great story this evening. Mike Parker is our speaker tonight. He's with the California Institute of Environmental Studies, but he's going to be actually sharing with you about a program that he worked on quite a number of years ago. As a reminder, we do record our program, and then I'll be putting it up on YouTube. If there's any editing that needs to be done, sometimes it takes me a little bit to get it up there, but it will be up there. So if you want to share it with others that weren't able to come tonight, you're welcome to do that. And next month, we are going to be hearing about a program called It's Not Just Birds, Plants of the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area. And that'll be with one of our own docents, Charlie Russell, who is quite the plant expert. And he's going to be talking about both the natives and the non-native plants that you can find out there. So when you're driving around in the wildlife area and you're looking at the birds and you go, I wonder what that is. Those are the kind of plants he's going to be sharing with us. All right, so I am going to go ahead and turn over to Mike so that he can do our program, and then I'll wrap us up here at the end. So let me spotlight you, Mike.
All right.
There you are.
Good to go. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out and listening to the talk. I think this is my first ever Zoom talk, but I'm going to be presenting. I guess I should share my screen, right? Let's see. Take care of a couple. Is that showing up?
Yes.
Okay, let me just show. Okay, there we go. All right. So I'm going to be talking about a project that I really had the honor of working on. Oh gosh, I started actually working on this project back in 1994 and got into the field aspect of it in 1995, 96. But it's a restoration project, and I'll go through explaining it. How we used what we call social attraction to restore a breeding colony of common murres out on the coast. And you can see in my title slide here that I have the Fish and Wildlife Service, Humboldt State University, and Audubon highlighted. They were the folks that we worked with. I worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service at the time, and these were the folks that worked with us in the field aspect, but we were also sort of overseen by a trustee council because this was an oil spill settlement that occurred, and the trustee council was run by the National Oceanic and NOAA, and then California Department of Fish and Game at the time, which is now Fish and Wildlife, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So there was a large group of people that were involved in this project. And then I'm going to put in, let's see, is it going? Yeah, put in a little plug for the organization that I work for now, the California Institute of Environmental Studies. We're a small nonprofit that's located here in Davis, and we sort of dedicate our work to the conservation of coastal and marine birds and ecosystems. And we do work around the Pacific Rim. So we actually have done work in Mexico. A lot of our work is done in the Channel Islands these days. But we have projects in Oregon, Washington. We've had projects in Alaska, and we have a project in Japan we're working on with Japanese murrelets. So I also want to acknowledge Jerry McChesney. This is my buddy here. I started working with Jerry in 1989 on seabirds, and he took over the murre restoration project when I left the project in right around 2002. And Jerry's currently the manager at the Farallon National Wildlife Refuge, and he's still leading the murre project, the work that's going on. So just to set the stage, I'm gonna, let's see if I turn on this laser pointer. Does that work, hopefully? Double slide you can see is here along the coast of California. This is San Francisco and San Pablo Bay. The Golden Gate is here, the Farallon Islands. And on this map, I sort of put the major murre colonies along the coast of California. And then down here south of Monterey Bay is Castle and Hurricane Rocks. So these are areas that I'll talk about in this talk, and just to get you familiar with the area that I'll be talking about. So Devil Slide Rock is right off the Devil Slide Highway portion of Highway 1. It's just a really small rock. It's something like 15 meters high. There's not a lot of room on top, maybe 150 square feet up there, probably a little more than that, I guess, but it's a very small rock, but it has a fairly large number of murres. And back in 1979, there was an estimate of about 2,500 murres on the rock. And I think in 1982, they estimated closer to 3,000 birds on the rock. But by 1986, there weren't any murres left nesting on this rock. And so what I'm going to talk about is the story of how that became, and then how we went about restoring the birds to the rock. But before we get into that, I think it really is helpful for you to understand a little bit about murre biology. So I have some video that we took of murres out on Devil Slide, and I'll talk a little bit about their breeding biology. So murres are in the alcid family if you're a bird person, and they're a very long-lived species. So birds that have been individually ringed or tagged with markers, like out at the Farallones, or there's been work done in Europe on murres, they can live up to 30, 35, maybe even 40 years old. And they're often called, a lot of people say they look like penguins, and they're called the penguins of the north, except they can fly, and they can dive really deep. They fly underwater, and they can go hundreds of feet deep to find food. They're amazing flyers, and they're amazing divers. They spend most of their life at sea, but they come back to these rocks along the coast of California to breed. And typically their breeding season, they'll start laying eggs in April, and they can have chicks on the rocks as late as August of any year. Now, when a bird selects a spot, so here's a common murre here, an adult murre, and it's on this location on the rock. When it finds a mate and selects a spot on a colony, it will return to that exact spot with its mate year after year after year. And so it's just a small few inches of space on this rock that they'll return to. And they just, they don't build a nest, but they'll lay an egg right on the rock. And let's see, somehow my bar got in the way of my moving slides. There we go. So this, I'm just going to show you some videos, hopefully, if I can get them to work, this is a pair of murres out on an island, and this is birds that are doing called allopreening, where a bird is just preening the other bird. And we use these behaviors to give you an indication of pairs, but also mates will alloprene, or neighbors will alloprene each other. And it's sort of just a, hey, I'm friendly, you don't need to fight with me, we're neighbors kind of thing. So we use these behaviors to look at murres and kind of understand what's going on a colony. The other thing about murres you need to know is they're very social, and they nest shoulder to shoulder to shoulder in these huge colonies. Tens of thousands of murres can be on a colony together. So this is a photograph of a colony out at Point Reyes, and you can see all these are breeding murres with eggs under them, and these little pockets form these nests, really wonderful cesspools of water from the murre guano and the ocean water spraying up there. But yeah, they're just amazing colonies that these birds form. And then they lay one egg, and the egg is huge. And I'm gonna see if I can get this video to play. Yeah, and this is just a montage of sort of how different a murre egg can look. They go from white with black spots all the way up to just plain white to these turquoise blue green colors with black spots. And like I said, this egg is really huge. It weighs about 1/3 of the female body weight. So a murre weighs about roughly 1,000 grams, and these eggs weigh about 300 grams or so. And like I said, they just lay them right on the rock, right on the ground. When they're incubating the egg, you'll see they rest it on their legs, their tarsus, and on their feet. Here's a really good example of that. And then they have a brood patch where the feathers fall off on their body, and they cover the egg against, so it goes against their skin and keeps it warm. And they incubate that egg for roughly about 32 days. And of course, with one egg comes one chick. But before you can get that chick, they have 32 days of incubating, and both male and female will incubate the egg. And this is a pretty delicate time for the murre egg because they're nesting shoulder to shoulder. Now I'm going to try to show you this video and hopefully it'll show up. So I got the spotlight on one murre here, and this is a bird that's incubating the egg currently, and this is its mate. And it's trying to come in to take over incubation duties. And you can see, and this is what a murre colony sounds like as well. Hopefully you can hear that sound. And you can see the mate allopreening its incubating mate and kind of saying, okay, honey, I'm ready to take over duties. And, oh, there's the egg. Yep, so here's the egg. Yep, okay, now come on over. And now it's climbing over the other murre. And this is where the eggs can get knocked off, and kicked away, and lost, and they're not very good at retrieving their eggs. If that egg moves too far from that little spot, they'll never be able to get it back. So here's they've switched now, and now this new bird is trying to get the egg out and onto its feet. So there it goes, and settling in and pushing the egg on. And we're pretty happy now. Pretty much done. All the drama's over. The exchange. So an incubation shift for a murre lasts about 24 hours. And that bird will sit on the egg for about 24 hours, and the mate will fly off and go feed on the ocean. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how challenging it can be for them to change incubation duties. And like I said, they get one chick out of that one egg, and the chick stays on the rock for about 21 days, 3 weeks, where the adults have to feed it. And so this is an example of what sort of a typical feeding of a murre chick looks like. Hopefully I can get this to play. Yeah, so I don't have the sound on here, but here comes an adult murre, and it has an anchovy in its mouth, and it's calling. We can't hear it, but I'm telling you, it calls the chick, and here comes the chick out. And the adult keeps its head down so that the fish doesn't get stolen by any other murres around there, because they'll just rip the fish out of its mouth and feed it to their chick. So the chick grabbed the fish and down it went, just like that. So they get fed. It varies on how close prey are to the colony, how big the prey are, whole bunch of different factors. So, but sometimes the chicks will only get fed once a day, and sometimes they'll get fed up to 12 times a day. So, and I've seen it where the prey resources are really close to the colony and they're big, and the adults are bringing fish in, and the chick is trying to swallow fish, and it has so much in its mouth, the tail of the fish it just swallowed is sticking out, and it can't get the fish down anymore. It's pretty amazing. So like I said, that chick stays on the rock for about 21 days, roughly. 18 to 25 days is the general range. And this is really grainy, but so when they leave the rock, they're not able to fly. But they'll jump off the top of these big, tall rocks and sort of tumble down into the water. And this is a video of a murre chick about to leave the colony. So here's the chick and its parent. And I believe this is the other parent coming in. And we have a cormorant up here that's poking, he'll start poking at these guys. But the parents are trying to coax the chick to jump, saying, come on, come on. And eventually one of the parents will fly down to the water and call from the water, and there goes that parent. So now it's down on the water calling, and the chick is sitting at the edge of this cliff, waiting to jump, trying to get up the nerve. And if you aren't don't look away, there it goes. That was it. It's gone. So it just happens that quick, and it'll tumble down, and they're bodies are amazingly nimble. I've seen them bouncing off rocks and then get into the water and they'll just swim away. But most of this happens like right at dusk and the first sort of hours after sunset. Then the chick goes off to sea and the male murre takes care of the chick at sea. And mom goes off and sort of replenishes from laying that huge egg. Then that chick will stay at sea. It may come back to the colony in a couple years to start looking for a nesting site, but it won't actually breed till it's 4 to 6 years old. So all these different aspects of the murre biology was really important to us in order to get a colony reestablished. Now, the other really important thing that we learned about murres in California is that they actually form these huge rafts off the colonies in winter. So pretty much, and that's fairly unusual. It happens a little bit in Oregon, but usually a lot closer to the breeding season. And here in California, starting in December, murres will start rafting up off their colonies, and every so often, a group of birds will get up off the water and fly over their nesting site on the colony. And I don't know what triggers them, but all of a sudden they'll start landing. And then everyone on the water gets up and starts going in and landing, and they're going to the colony and defending their little space on the rock and sort of starting to say, hey, this is my space, you can't have it, I'm gonna nest here. And so that aspect of murre biology is really important because they're coming to their colonies year round here in California. So back to our story of what happened at Devil's Slide Rock. So again, in the early 80s, 1979 to 1982, there were roughly 2,500 to 3,000 murres out on Devil's Slide Rock. But at that same time in California, fishermen, gillnet fishermen, were switching their nets from twine gill nets to monofilament gill nets. And these monofilament gill nets were not only good at catching fish, they were good at catching seabirds. The twine nets, the birds could see underwater. These monofilament nets, they couldn't see. And so the birds were swimming into the nets and getting killed and drowned in huge numbers. So there are some estimates that between 1980 and 1987, 75,000 murres died. And so this is a gillnet boat down in the Monterey Bay area. And it might be hard to see on your slide, but this is a murre in the net. And these are all murres or multiple murres in the water that this person pulled out of their net and discarded in the water. So in those early 1980s, although colonies were doing fairly well, this gillnet mortality was a major factor, and colonies declined 45% to complete loss, like we saw at Devil's Slide. But the other contributing factor at Devil's Slide was an oil spill. In 1986, there was an oil barge called the Apex Houston that left San Francisco Bay and headed south, and it had a broken hatch cover on the barge, and it slopped oil out as it went down the coast. And I actually should have looked this up. I forgot how much oil was spilled, but it's a fairly significant number. And nearly 10,000 seabirds were killed, and 6,300 murres were picked up on the beaches between San Francisco and Monterey. And when biologists went out to look at the colonies that next year, they found that the murres weren't breeding at Devil's Slide Rock anymore. So this oil spill was sort of the straw that broke the colony, sort of broke the camel's back, and murres stopped breeding out at the colony. So the trustee organizations, agencies, sued the oil company to get money to restore the colony. And in that settlement, they were able to secure $4 million to reestablish a common murre colony at Devil's Slide Rock. And this, I believe, was the first case that was ever sort of settled or had an agreement through the courts on any oil spill. I'm not sure if Exxon Valdez got settled first, but this was one of the first oil spill settlements in the country. And it was fairly contentious in the courts because the defendants, the lawsuit that was brought and the laws that were used said that the money had to go to restoration. And the oil companies were saying, well, there's nothing you can do to restore seabirds. There's no methods to do it. There's nothing you can do. And the government argued that we could use this technique called social attraction. And social attraction was developed by a man named Dr. Steve Kress back in Maine, and he used it on puffins and terns. And it uses decoys and sound recordings of colonies and other attractants to bring live birds to a colony and hold them there so that they can meet other live birds, and then hopefully they'll start breeding. So we used murre decoys. We used mirrors. I'll talk about the mirrors. And we went out to the Farallon Islands and recorded murre vocalizations, much like the ones you heard in that video I played, to broadcast them out on this island. So getting the lawsuit money was sort of the first step. The second step was, yeah, they argued in court that we could do this restoration, but no one had ever done it with murres before. So exactly how were we going to do this restoration work? And I was actually fortunate. I was working at the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, and the biologists there were doing a lot of the work at the Farallons on seabirds and counting seabirds. And somehow with my experience, they put me in charge of this project, which was an amazing honor and a ton of fun. So the first thing I decided I needed to do was bring on a really good team of people. So this person here is Harry Carter. He's a seabird biologist who is well known in California and did a ton of work for seabirds. And he was one of our experts on our team to help us restore double slide rock. And he's probably the best skiff boat operator I've ever worked with. He's an amazing boat operator. And then we brought in Steve Kress is the man on the right. He's the father of social attraction. And Dr. Rick O'Lightly on the left, he's a professor at Humboldt State University, retired now, who had a lot of experience with doing research and management. And we brought Rick on our team. And then I went out and got two really good field biologists. Elizabeth McLaren on the left, she had studied murres on the Farallons for something like 3, 4, 5 years. And on the right is Sue Schubel. And Sue's an amazing woman who worked on Project Puffin back in Maine. And not only is she a field biologist, she's an artist. So she actually sculpted our decoys models and sent them off to the folks who made our decoys for us, and did a lot of work in that regard on the project. So just amazing field biologists. So we had our team. And one thing we wanted to do was try to learn a little bit more about this technique called social attraction. So we developed a study plan where we looked at different densities of decoys, and we used different styles of decoys. So I'm going to try to go back a slide. Elizabeth, joking around here, has a murre decoy on her head that was an incubating decoy. So when a murre is incubating a decoy, it lays flatter and it arches its back and it drops its wings to hold the egg in place. But if a murre is just on the rock and standing up, they have a more upright posture. So we use both incubating posture and standing posture. And these are just schematics of the densities of decoys. So we had a low density with roughly 15 decoys, medium density with roughly 25 decoys, and a high density with 50 decoys. And really what we wanted to do was just make a donut sort of shape and have all these decoys in a circle with a hole in the middle, because really we thought murres like to be protected when they're nesting, and they like all these other murres around them to protect them. But it really wasn't feasible by the shape of the rock and just the design. The other thing we knew about murres is they like to nest up against ledges. So this is a schematic, but this we imagine would be a ledge that we would put what we call our front line of decoys on. And then we created a space in between where our thoughts were, if we did attract murres to the rock, they would walk amongst these decoys and maybe feel more comfortable and nest in these areas And then we put mirrors on the corner, and really the mirrors sort of had two functions. One, when a live bird looks in it, it sees itself and it starts interacting with it. And again, we're just trying to hold murres as long as we could on the rock. And that's just sort of entertainment for them in a way, and would keep them on there. But the other thing it did is it made it look like the colony was a lot bigger than it really was, because it reflected all the decoys that were near it. So we had to make sure that, you know, this was a schematic we talked about in the office, and we had ordered we put out roughly 400 decoys our first year. We ordered our decoys and got them in, and then we kind of were like, well, can we actually fit 50 decoys in a 1 meter by 2 meter square plot? And so we laid these things out in our warehouse to make sure we could do the work. And then what I consider the really challenging part of the project came on, and that was doing the logistics of getting on this rock. Oh, so I forgot about this. So little schematic, this is kind of a hand-drawn map of the top of Devil Slide. And we put out 4 different treatment blocks, if you will. So we had 4 of each of the blocks, plus we put out what we call the control, where we had an open space without any decoys whatsoever that we had marked. So we could, when we were watching the rock, what we wanted to do is if we did get any murres, we wanted to see were they interacting with decoys or were they hanging out in the open where there wasn't any space or there wasn't any decoys. So getting on Devil Slide was a challenge, and there's a lot of people who said that there's no way that this project was going to work just because you'd never be able to get on to the rock. And it is challenging, but we were able to do it. And again, using Harry Carter, who's an excellent boat driver, we were able to get people on the rock, and our motto sort of became just jump. And you can imagine we were trying to put decoys out in the winter, right? Because that's when murres are coming to the rock. But of course, that's the biggest swell time of the year out California. And so we were going out in fairly decent swells and trying to do this work. And it became pretty challenging. Getting people onto the rock was the first sort of step, and getting people off of the rock safely became really important. But then climbing the rock, we had to use technical climbing gear, ropes and harnesses, and set anchors. And this is one of our teammates. So this is where we would start the actual technical climbing, climb up this ridge, get over this wall that was about 6 feet high, and then climb the rest of the way up to the top of the rock. And then once you got people on, you had to get the gear on. Like I said, we had 400 decoys, solar panels to get up, car batteries to power the sound system that we use, the speakers. The car batteries, I think, weighed about 50 pounds each. So just handing these things off from the boat and getting them to the top of the rock was a major problem. We actually considered having the equipment landed on the rock by a helicopter. But when the helicopter crews went and looked at it, they said, yeah, no, we're not doing that. The rock wasn't quite flat enough on the top, and they were afraid that they would lower their load and release the sling, and it would just all go tumbling off into the ocean. And they didn't want anyone on the rock when they were going to do that. So we just did it the old-fashioned way, the fire line and passing buckets. But in this case, it was passing bags of decoys. So we got these really heavy-duty canvas bags that could fit about 10 to 12 decoys in them, and just had a larger boat that we would have all the decoys on, and take our smaller Zodiac boat to that, fill it up, come over to the rock, and just start tossing. And then hand hauling all that gear to the top. And then it was putting out all the decoys in our little schematic design of low, medium, and high density plots. So it typically took us, every year that we set up decoys, it took us about, I think it was 3, maybe 4 days to get things set up. This is one of our first trips out, and I love this photograph because This is me when I was younger and had more hair, and Elizabeth and Sue Schubel here. And I think this is like our second or third day out on the rock. And all of a sudden, these really big sets of swells started coming in that weren't predicted. And these were large, and we had to get off the rock. And this is a particular swell that someone caught us looking at in the photo. It came crashing across the rock, and it was so loud and so big, all of us just turned to look at it. And I think maybe Jen Boyce, who worked on our project, took this photo, but caught us looking at it. But we were able to get off safely that day. There was some thought that we were going to have to sleep on the rock that night, but we were able to get off and make it back to Princeton Harbor safely. But that was probably one of the sort of I don't know, high energy days for me. I was a little nervous getting off the rock that day. And we also like to have fun. These incubating decoys were made out of plastic, and we actually contracted, I don't know if anyone has heard of Mad River Canoes, but the person who owned Mad River Canoes actually took our mold and used the same process that they used to make canoes, and they made our incubating murre decoys. And our standing decoys were made out of wood. But he sent us, his shipment came in about Christmas time our first year, so he sent us a murre decoy, which I thought was pretty funny, given the spice of the Magi brought to the baby Jesus. It was pretty funny. So we had to put the murre out there for a little bit. We didn't leave it out there, but that decoy went out every time we set up decoys while we were putting them up, and then it came home with us. So this is an example of our large high density plot, and you can see sort of the little ledge that murres sort of like to nest up against, and incubating decoys and standing decoys, and see the reflection of the murres in the mirrors in our little aisle. So once we got everything set up, it was just time to watch and wait. And we kind of figured it would be several years before we had any breeding, and it might be even a year or two before we had murres coming and standing out on the rock. But the next day after we set up decoys, we had murres showing up on the rock. There were 3 or 4 murres that showed up, and this is our cruise off of Highway 1, just south of Pacifica, looking at the rock. And we used these high-powered scopes, and we spent hours and hours watching murres come in. And we'd have these training sessions with our field staff. And one of the other really great things we were able to do with this project is we were able to study the murres at the Farallones and at Point Reyes and down on that Castle and Hurricane colonies down on the Big Sur coast. And we use those sort of as our controls to understand, you know, were murres doing well? We didn't want to have decoys out and learn that, oh, it was a horrible year in the ocean for seabirds and they all didn't breed, and we wanted to know that information if that was happening. Or, hey, it was a really great year for seabirds, so we should be seeing murres at Devil's Slide Rock. So we had a pretty big crew, and they were all out watching murres along the coast from Point Reyes down to Big Sur. And I like to show this photo because this is like before Highway 1. This section of Highway 1 now is a bike path and a hiking path. So you can actually go out there and walk there. But we were out there when trucks were rolling by, and it was pretty interesting time. And now it's this wonderful little bike path, and you can go through the tunnel that they put at Pacifica there and calmly walk up the path and get to where you can look out and see Devil's Slide right from the side of the path. So this is a more recent crew still out there watching the murres at Devil's Slide. There's an old World War II bunker at that site, and we would hike up to that, and this gave us a different vantage point, and we'd often use that as a spot to watch the murres as well. And you can see the rock doesn't look very big, and it's not very big, but it holds a lot of murres. So this is an aerial photograph that we flew over in a plane, and shooting out the belly port of the plane, we took a picture of the rock in the first year of the colony. And this yellow framed section is this blow up over here. And I'm going to show you, so these black birds are Brandt's cormorants, and they're on nests. And you can kind of see our decoys are getting whitewashed. So these are all decoys in here full of guano from cormorants. And these dark black and white birds are the live murres that came in and started nesting. And you can see some just amongst the decoys here. Here's 2 pairs sitting in. So actually this, knowing that, this was more like year 2 or 3 that this photo was taken. And going back to this larger photo, you can see all the cormorants that were nesting. If you remember that photo from 1979, there weren't very many cormorants out there. But once the murres were wiped out from the rock, cormorants came in, and this was probably roughly 80 to 100 cormorant nests a year out on Devil's Slide. But we started, the restoration work, and murres started coming in. And so we would look at this and follow each individual pair and monitor whether they had chicks, whether they laid eggs, what they were feeding if we could. That was really hard to see from the mainland, but sometimes we could get diet information, what they were feeding their chicks. So the big thing is, we thought the first year it was unbelievable. We had 6 pairs of murres breed, and we just never thought, we thought it would be years before we had breeding occur. And they actually fledged 3 chicks. And if I remember right, our first chick to fledge jumped off the rock on the night of the 4th of July, and we ended up calling it Indy for Independence Day. But it was, we were all like, just seeing the first egg on the rock that year in May, we were excited. So all this observation that we did from all these people spending hours and hours out there, of course, we analyzed that data. And some of the things we learned were that most of our murres were spending time in the aisles within the low density plots. So they liked the open spaces, and the high and medium density plots were probably just a little too dense for them. They like to have the protection of their neighbors, but they like a little more space when they're first starting out. We had thousands of observations. We would scan the rock every 5 minutes or 10 minutes and take a behavior of every murre that we saw on the rock. And in analyzing that, so we had thousands of observations of murres. Rarely did we see a murre not within the decoys. And the only time we pretty much did is when they were walking from one decoy group to the other. And the mirrors seemed to be really important in that first year. The first birds that came onto the rock spent a lot of time and even nested really close to the mirrors. Within a couple feet of the mirrors, all of our nests in that first year occurred. So these are some of the things we learned. And as time went on, we started doing adaptive management because our colony really started growing. So this top graph here shows just the number of breeding pairs and then the number of birds that were established territories. So these were birds that were hanging out in one spot on the rock, but they didn't lay an egg, but they were there every day, sort of defending a spot. So you can see 6 pairs in our first year, then we went to 9 and 13 and then jumped to 70. So as we started getting more live birds, the colony really took off. And this is 10 years. So as things grew, we started adapting our management. The first 3 years, we put out all the decoys that we had. And oh, I forgot to mention, and I don't think I showed any photos of them, but in the first 3 years, we actually put out murre chick and egg decoys. And we thought that was really important. But one thing we learned is that when we were going out there, we were causing too much disturbance. So we'd put the adult decoys out in January, and then we'd go back out in April to put out egg and chick decoys. But it was really too close to the breeding season, and we were probably causing too much disturbance to those birds by going up there. So we stopped putting out egg and chick decoys after the 3rd year. And you can see the colony really just started growing, and we just kept decreasing our decoys and actually rearranging them to protect our breeders and sort of using them as walls to keep cormorants and other predators. Not that cormorants are predators, but they will poke at murres and cause disturbance. and keep those other birds away from our murres. So the colony really just started growing. And then you can see from our graph, that data went up to about here, 2005. The colony has really just taken off since then. So we stopped putting out decoys, and ocean conditions have been really good, and the colony has just grown and grown. And so you can see we're back to the level of the colony that it used to be before the oil spill and before the gillnet mortality that occurred. So it's a really, really fun project, really amazing thing to work on. The people that I worked with were incredible. I love this story. It's just really fun, and it's sort of why I got into this field of conservation. So one of the things that we had to deal with, especially in the early years, was that a lot of people were critical. Like I said, they didn't think it would work. And then a lot of people said, oh, murres are showing up there, but they're not really breeding successfully and they're not doing well. So this is a graph that just shows productivity, which is the number of chicks that are fledged from the rock or jump off the rock per pair that we have out on the rock. So you can see it fluctuated in the early years, and there are some bad years, but there's always some bad years in the Gulf of California for all seabirds. But we've been pretty much doing well as far as productivity. And this red line represents the mean productivity at the Farallon Islands, and this is the deviation from that mean. And for the most part, we're right in there, except for a few bad years. And I think 2004 maybe, or 2005 was a year where pelicans came in and caused a lot of disturbance to the colony. And I'm not sure what happened in 2006, but 2009, I believe, was an El Nino year. And so I think we've shown that the Devil Slide Rock colony is doing quite well. Not only are birds producing, laying eggs, they're producing chicks and doing well. It's not just a source or a sink where birds come in and die. So this is that photo again from 1979 from the mainland area, and we tried to replicate that photo the last couple of years, and this is what it looks like now, trying to get into the same exact spot. And you can see just the top of the rock is covered with murres like it is here, and this end. It even looks like there's probably more murres on this left-hand edge of the rock than there was in '79. And this is a photo from the air again, looking down on the colony. And you can see there's still some Brandt's cormorants nesting out on the colony, but not nearly as many. There's only probably like 20 nests now instead of 100 nests. But the rock is pretty much all available space that's good for nesting murres is covered. And I think this little spot here, which is a little ledge that we would climb up over here and walk up this ledge to get to the top. I think this spot still has some room for murres to grow and number on. But other than that, it's looking pretty packed and pretty full. So a lot of people often ask me, why do you think it was so successful here? Like, how come at Devil Slide? And I like to kind of say, well, it's the decoys. There were no murres there. There were no murres showing up for 10 years after the oil spill, and we put out the decoys, and the birds showed up. So it's pretty simple to deduce that it was our social attraction. But I also think that it's because murres are long-lived species, and there's really a chance that those first breeders in that first year were actually birds that were breeding on Devil Slide Rock in the early 1980s. And maybe they had gone somewhere else to breed, or maybe they weren't breeding at all. But because they're so long-lived, those birds could have survived and come back to breeding that first year. And once we put out a colony again, like I said, they're very social birds. They were probably, if they were birds from that rock, they were like, all right, we're home again. Everybody's back. Let's go. We've learned that Brandt's cormorants nesting are actually a really important source of protection for murres that are starting new colonies. In recent years, the murre numbers, and I'll show you some graphs soon, in Central California have really been growing and growing on all the colonies. And we're seeing new colonies pop up now on other rocks along the coast, but they almost always start establishing amongst a Brandt's cormorant colony. So the fact that we had Brandt's cormorants nesting on Devilslide when we started doing the social attraction work probably just helped our work as well. We didn't have any major predators at Devilslide, so western gulls and common ravens, which are known predators to murre and murre eggs. There's a couple gull nests on the rock, but they never seemed to bother the murres and were never a problem. Again, I talked about the productivity. We had really good productivity, so chicks were getting produced, and as those chicks aged out on the ocean, they were coming back. And I think I probably forgot to tell this about murre biology, but typically murres will return to the colony they were hatched from. So most of the time they will go back to the same colony they hatched from. So starting a new colony is even hard. It's difficult to do, or seeing a new colony start up is unusual because of that. But as space gets filled up on these colonies, of course, other birds are going to look other locations if it's just too crowded. Again, I think putting together a really great team, and this is a slide of a bunch of folks that worked on the project, and we had a 20th year anniversary. And unfortunately, Harry, who worked on our project and was key in getting this project going and happening, was ill. And actually, it was really just surreal that he passed away the next day after our party. And he wasn't able to come to the party, and he died of cancer the next day. It was just kind of crazy that we had this reunion and he hung in until the party was over. But then the other thing that a lot of people don't talk about, but I like to, and that's that we were well funded. We had enough money to do this project. We weren't leveraging money from other sources per se. The agencies that fought for this project got us enough money so that we could monitor murres at other locations, so we knew what was happening at those colonies. And we had enough money to hire really good people and get really good equipment so that we could do this project right. Now, one aspect that we didn't think about was this is what our decoys looked like at the end of each season, covered with guano. So we had to go out and remove the decoys every year and bring them back. We literally had to dig them out of the bird guano and scrape them off, and we would bring them back to the refuge headquarters. And these blue barrels we would fill with borax and water and soak the decoys for about 24 hours and scrape and wash them clean. But one great aspect that the trustee council, I'll give them full credit for, was they really wanted to have an education program as part of this project. And at San Francisco Bay Refuge, we had an amazing environmental education program. And this is Amy Hutzel, who was one of the environmental educators there, and a woman named Fran McTammany. They designed an amazing seabird outreach environmental education program. And we went into all the schools in the Half Moon Bay, Princeton, sort of Princeton Harbor area, Montera, and did this environmental education program about our project. And then we got the kids to repaint our decoys, because after we cleaned them, the paint got scraped off and, things got broken and we had to repair bills, and the kids loved it. They got to partake in this project. It was really a great program that taught them stewardship, taught them about a project in their backyard. And it's actually amazing how many kids, I would go into a grocery store or into a coffee shop in Half Moon Bay, and there'd be a kid there with their parents, and they'd start saying, "That's the guy with the murres. That's the guy who's doing that project with the decoys." It was amazing. They really got into the project. And I think actually this was one of the really great aspects of the project that we worked on. And then we also use volunteers, and this is a great volunteer at the refuge, Betty Foster, and she would come in and those first few years, we had these chick decoys out, which unfortunately you can't see it real well, but we actually put a cloth material on the chick decoys, again, just because we thought the adult birds would peck at the cloth and it would hold them on the rock a little longer. And Betty would come in and re-glue all this fabric back onto all our chick decoys every year and really help us out. We had a lot of different volunteers that helped us, but this is how we got things done. And then later in the year, when we are in the project, when we stopped putting decoys out, we had these batteries still on the rock and in these solar panels. And this is Jerry McChesney. And Jerry had a great idea. The technology was around at this point. It certainly wasn't available in 1996 for me to do this. But by 2005, 2006, we had technology to put up a camera system out on the rock. And that's how we got that video I showed you earlier. And with the camera, we were able to pick up a lot of different data that couldn't be gathered before. Like we were able to get banded birds. These birds were banded out at the Farallones, these cormorants. We could really determine eggs under birds. You know, from the mainland, it was often sometimes really hard to tell if a bird had an egg or not, especially the angle we were looking at. But with these cameras, we were really able to pick that up. And then I think I mentioned earlier, telling what kind of fish they were bringing into their chicks. It was really hard to tell from the mainland. Occasionally we could figure it out, but most times we couldn't. But with the camera, you could just zoom right in and tell the different fish, like a surf perch here and a smelt and the northern anchovy that got dropped on the ground. So the camera was really useful. But what I really thought was great about the camera is it allowed us to broadcast across the internet. And what we did was, this is Devil Slide Rock here in San Pedro Rock in the background. We actually beamed the signal to the Montero Lighthouse hostel. And they had put up a monitor in their hostel, in their common area of their hostel. And we actually had controls in there. So when the biologists weren't using the cameras to monitor the birds, anyone staying at the hostel could come in and move the cameras around and zoom in on what they wanted. But then the hostel let us tag into their internet and we could broadcast this camera across the internet. So people got a really great look at murre colonies, live action of murre colonies using that camera. And now, we don't put up the camera anymore, but this was just, I think for a number of years, probably a decade, or maybe not quite that long, they had the camera going. Just really another great project. So now, you know, people are still monitoring Devil Slide Rock, but one of the things we learned in those early years was that these murre colonies were under constant siege. So there were planes and helicopters flying over, and it would cause the murres to flush off the rock, and they would lose their eggs and lose their chicks. Their chicks would be taken by gulls, and this would occur at all the colonies, Devil Slide, up at Point Reyes, down on the Big Sur coast. In fact, one of the worst days of the year for disturbance was during the Big Sur Marathon, down on those colonies at Castle and Hurricane. And that's because there are all these news outlets flying in their helicopters to photograph the runners running along the Big Sur coast. And those colonies occur right at a very famous bridge called the Bixby Bridge. And if you don't know the Bixby Bridge, I guarantee you've seen it in commercials, because it is filmed often for car commercials or phone commercials or other types of commercials. It's a very scenic view. And the helicopters would just come in and disturb the birds. So we worked for a number of years to try to get that disturbance stopped. And then another thing that sort of picked up on the California coast was a live fish commercial fishery. So these fishermen were coming in and put box traps to catch rockfish live and sell them live at the markets. And they would get really close to the colonies and flush the birds. And so we published some papers on this type of disturbance and talked to agencies and other folks. And the trustees came together and got funding and started what's called the Seabird Protection Network. And now there's a group of folks up and down the coast of California that are monitoring these colonies on a regular basis and watching for disturbance. And the best part about this program and this network is they do major outreach to pilots and boat captains. And so every year they do education. And I just actually was in a meeting today where they were talking about how they, because of COVID, they had to do their outreach online. And they actually were able to reach 800 pilots this year through their outreach, when normally they reach maybe like about 100, because all these pilots wanted to come on and hear what they had to say. I really encourage you to go online and Google the Seabird Protection Network and see what they're up to. It's a really amazing program, and it's really helped protect our colonies. And I believe it's one of the reasons that the colonies are increasing again and really growing rapidly on the coast, because the colonies are so well protected now. The other thing that was happening in early in our studies was there was still gillnet mortality happening, even though they stopped. So in the 80s, when the gillnet mortality happened, they put in laws that pushed the gillnetting offshore. So up in the Devil Slide area, fishermen couldn't set their nets in waters less than 240 feet deep. But in Monterey, they were still allowed to set their nets anywhere from 180 feet or less of water. And there were some sea otters that showed up dead and some harbor porpoises that showed up dead. And so people started wondering what was going on and started doing some studies. And so between 1995 and 1998, they were looking at doing this observer program on fishing boats in Monterey Bay. And they estimated that 13,000 murres were killed in those 4 years in Monterey Bay. And there were like 100 sea otters and hundreds of harbor porpoise that were killed in the gillnets. So they actually got law passed to push the gillnets further offshore, and that sort of threat to at least seabirds is mostly gone away now. And all this stuff, like removing gill netting and reducing disturbance at the colonies from boating and planes, has really resulted, and having decent food resources in the last few years, resulted in the murre colonies really going. So these are some graphs of the different colonies I talked about along the coast. So this is at Point Reyes headlands, and you can see it looks like this colony is starting to plateau. I mean, when I was out doing work, we had 18,000 murres out there. Now there's 60,000 murres breeding out there. Here's Devil Slide Rock, which still seems to be going up, but I think we're starting to plateau at around 3,000 birds. I don't think there's much more room out there. Castle and Hurricane, this is the one I really think the disturbance and the gillnet mortality, stopping that is really helping this colony go. And just in the last few years since that gill netting was stopped, it's really taken off, and it's at about 9,000 birds. And there's a lot of room on those rocks down there. I think that colony is going to really keep growing as long as the food resources in the ocean are healthy. And then so these 3 colonies I didn't have on my map, but they're north of Golden Gate and south of Point Reyes. And the only rock that doesn't seem to be doing well is this Miller Points rock, and we aren't really sure why. There's some thought that there's a portion of this rock that actually fell off into the ocean, but it wasn't a huge portion. But that certainly took out a few hundred nest sites from being used, because it's no longer there for the murres to use. But something about it they don't like, and my guess is that it could be predators like ravens have learned to take murre eggs there, possibly. But I don't think folks know quite what is going on there. But the 2 other rocks, which are within a mile or 2 of Miller's Point rocks, are doing well, and they're growing. Double Point Rocks is growing. And then our largest colony at the Farallones, here's the North Farallon Islands, a group of 4 rocks, and they've just really taken off, and there's about 100,000 murres out there now. And at the Farallones now, we're up to about 250,000 murres nesting. And, I didn't get into the story of the Farallones, but I'll just touch on it. Back at the turn of the century, murre eggs were collected out at the Farallones for food. And I don't know if folks know that story, but they would actually be collected and even shipped into Sacramento. And there's some documents that show that back in like the late 1800s, a dozen of murre eggs were selling for about $8 in Sacramento. So really expensive food. But that all took a toll on that colony, and it certainly was in really low numbers back in the, I think it was around 40,000 murres back in the mid 1980s. And now we're up to about 250,000 murres out there. So murres are doing well. I think we picked a good time to try to restore Devil Slide. There's a whole bunch of people that were involved in this project. And I would like to acknowledge them and all the hard work that all these field staff and agencies did to help us do this work. Especially thank Harry. He was a great mentor and a great partner to have, and really miss having him around. And he did so much for seabird conservation in California. He's greatly missed for all his work. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. What a great story. Really, really enjoyed what you shared. We do have a couple of people who have put in chat some questions.
Sure.
So I'd like to toss those out to you. Yeah, so let's start with that.
Sure.
So let's see, the first one, I think you answered about the gill nets, but are they outlawed at this point, or is it just that they're farther offshore?
You know, I probably should have looked up for the latest on that, but last I knew they were just pushed further offshore, so they aren't as big a problem. The other thing is they were mostly getting used for a halibut fishery in Monterey, and there were very few fishermen doing that. So I'm not even sure if that fishery is going strong anymore. So I don't have a good answer for that, but
that's okay.
Yeah.
Next one is, if the chicks return to the home colony, how is gene replenishment accomplished?
How is gene replenishment?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's, again, it's not all, but most chicks will return to the colony they were hatched from. So it's a good question. There is some movement, and I guess I haven't looked at any genetics papers on murres, but I would imagine there's enough movement that the genetic resources aren't bottlenecked, if you will. So yeah, not all of them do, but most of them do. So
do they actually mate on that island, or do they mate elsewhere and just come there to?
No, yeah. So when they pick a spot and they pick a mate, they choose the island. That's where they mate, and once they do that, they rarely will switch colonies to a different site. Yeah. So.
Okay, so the next one, with the efforts against gill nets and aerial disturbance, how would you describe the relationship with those industries?
Well, I think in the 80s, I wasn't here, but I think it was pretty contentious. But when I was working on the Monterey project and presenting our data of how this colony isn't growing, but and people were presenting the data on how many murres were killed, it was fairly hostile at that meeting. The fishermen weren't happy. Like I said, I think that at that time, that was in roughly 2000, 2001 when I was at that meeting. But I think there were only about 8 fishermen who were using gill nets in Monterey. And so it was, a small number of people that were having a pretty large impact. And then, the start of the disturbance from aircraft was fairly contentious. And there was a lot of talk of how we didn't have the right to limit them. Only the FAA could do that. And the FAA was not willing to put in restrictions over colonies. But over time, there's been a great relationship developed with the airports along the coast through the Seabird Protection Network. And they really work well together. And I don't know if you've heard of I think it's still going on, or probably not with the COVID stuff, but prior to that, the Dream Machines event at Half Moon Bay, where all these planes would fly in, that day was the big day of disturbance at Devil Slide, or that weekend. And we've developed really good relationships with them, and that work is going really well. And pilots are actually policing themselves and telling other pilots, hey, you can't fly below 1,000 feet along the coast in these areas. And so that work's gone really well, and the relationship has really changed into one of, I would say the network does a really great job of telling these pilots how they can fly and enjoy the coast, and actually they actually tell them some really great stuff they can go see, but just from 1,000 feet. And I think the pilots really enjoy that.
Super. Were the decoys anchored at all? Otherwise, it seems like a lot would be swept into the ocean.
Yeah, I didn't show that, but we had a gas-powered drill, and we actually drilled small holes and put them on rods that were inserted into the rock. And we kind of thought we'd be able to put the decoys out and leave them out there, but once we saw them getting covered with guano, we knew we were going to have to take them in and clean them. So we would leave the rods actually out there and cap the rods with a safety cap. And some of the photos, you probably could see those if you were, especially when I was showing the photo of Jerry putting up the camera system. You could see some of the rods there, and they've all been removed now, except for I think they still have a few wooden dowels out there to help identify a couple spots when they're doing their monitoring. But yeah, we definitely had to anchor them in, and we still lost some, like those ones that got knocked off rods, or somehow the rods got broken. They would get swept away, and actually had some people in Bolinas find them on the beach up at Bolinas. So.
One of the participants, Steve, commented that a couple years ago, I was at Devil's Slide looking at the colony, and there was a man there with his children. He told me that he was one of the kids that painted the decoys.
Oh, that's awesome.
Isn't that great?
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
Wow. That just made my night.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And then a question, wasn't there an episode of starved murre juveniles washing up on shore, and how did that affect the colony?
Yeah, I mean, I think that does happen occasionally, and there's been times when, throughout the years that happens, and I think it happened in Northern California this past year. But yeah, I mean, it'll affect the colony for sure, because you aren't having those birds return. But it's sort of a lag effect, right? So it takes 4 to 6 years before they breed. So you just won't see a big bump in numbers that 4 years later down the road.
You mentioned various disturbances of the colony. Have there been any issues with people flying drones?
Well, at Point Reyes, I know there has been, but even though they don't allow it, people have flown drones there, but nothing major. And so far as I know, to fly drones over the Gulf of the Farallones Marine Sanctuary, which is most of that, and the Monterey Bay Sanctuary, you need permits, and you have to stay above 1,000 feet, and they have all sorts of rules too. So not saying that people don't do it, but from what I know and talking with folks, there haven't been major issues with drones yet.
Fingers crossed, right?
Right.
Do you know how the birds recognize or know their breeding spot?
I don't know that. Yeah. Once they pick it, boy, though, they are tied into it. It's pretty amazing. I will say, we early on, it was like year 3 or 4, we had 2 birds lose their eggs. And I told you once they lose their eggs, they can't really get them back. But we had, I think because there was enough space and just the way the eggs fell away, we actually had 2 birds recover their eggs that rolled away. And we actually published a paper on that because it's so unique. Unfortunately, neither egg hatched. So I don't know if they got cracked when they rolled away or something happened to them. But one of them rolled away a little over 1 meter, and the bird actually rolled it all the way back to its original site. And the other one rolled away a little less than 1 meter, and the bird rolled it partway back and then started incubating it on the new site. And it incubated it for a number of days. The partner came back and they would switch, but then they just abandoned it. I don't know if it just because it wasn't their site, or maybe the egg cracked. I don't know what happened, but I don't know how they identify it, but they are good at it. And they have this amazing behavior when they fly in. We call it parading, but they'll put their head straight up in the air when they land. They're great flyers, just straight line, right? They're really fast and they go like, but they can't maneuver well. So when they come into a colony, it's like crash landing, and they'll land and they immediately throw their head up and start walking really fast, and they go right to their nest site. So we got good at telling birds that were what we called prospecting birds, birds that weren't breeding but landing for the first time, because they would land and try to walk through the colony and they wouldn't put their head up, and they would get hammered by the other birds. They would be pecking at them and trying to kick them out of there. But any breeder that came in, they would just throw their head up and they walk really quick and they go right to their nest site. They don't dilly-dally. They don't go anywhere else. It's pretty amazing. But I don't know how they identify it per se. But.
Pretty amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
Again, what a great story. Incredible work that was done to help these amazing birds out.
It was a really fun project.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And it's great to see success when you put that much effort forth.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I will say, if you Google returning home, there's a documentary on this project that we did, and it's on YouTube now. It's Returning Home, and I forget the sort of subtitle, but Returning Common Murres to Devil Slide Rock. But I think if you just Google Returning Home Devil Slide Rock, you'll find that video. It's about 20 minutes long. It's pretty good. I think that will give you a better feel for how challenging it was to get the boats up next to the rock and get the equipment off. There's some pretty good video in there of that.
Super. It doesn't look like I have more questions here in my chat. So again, I want to thank you, Mike, for lots of thank yous coming through.
Yeah. No.
People
Thank you.
appreciating and enjoying
it,
the talk. And actually, thanks to Marge Kohler too for bringing you to my attention, so that I knew to reach out. I saw her picture in your broad.
Yep. So I'll embarrass Marge a little bit. So I was this, fairly young at the time biologist, and she was the manager at the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, the project leader there. And this project came across, and there was sort of some question as to whether the refuge should take on the project, because as you could see, it's a really big project. It was going to take a lot of effort. There's a lot of controversy at the time about it. There's a lot of people who thought the money should be used for other things. And it was Marge. Marge was one of those people who said, no, we have to do it. We have to do this project. So she gets credit along with Harry Carter and a couple other people for really pushing the project. And if it wasn't for Marge, the project wouldn't have been done through the refuge anyways, and maybe not have been as successful. So.
Yay, Marge.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing with Yolo Basin Foundation. We do the education programs for the Yolo Bypass Wildlife Area here in Davis, California. And again, next month, we'll be talking about some of the plants that are out there in the wildlife area as people go and explore. Thanks for coming this evening, joining us, and hopefully we'll see some of you next month.
Okay, thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye-bye now.